Hey friends, tonight we're stepping into a world that feels both familiar and impossibly distant. The Middle Ages, a time of castles and cathedrals, of kings and peasants, of prayers whispered in candlelit chapels and markets that pulsed with life. But beneath the music of lutes and the rustle of linen robes was a smell that never went away. Imagine narrow cobbled lanes, choked with mud and refuse. A drizzle of rain that doesn't wash things clean, but instead turns the filth into a thick, foul sludge. The buzz of flies rises in the summer heat, while chamber pots clatter as they're tipped from upstairs windows into the streets below. This wasn't just dirt you could brush off. It was the dirt of daily life, woven into clothes, clinging to skin, carried in the very air people breathed. The belief was not that water made you clean, but that it made you sick. And so, instead of washing, people masked smells with herbs, clung to heavy garments, and prayed for protection against bad air. Tonight we'll wander through those alleys, sit inside smoky cottages, visit bathhouses both joyful and suspicious, and step into monasteries where monks kept cleaner than most kings. We'll discover why hygiene was less about soap and water, but more about fear, ritual, and survival. So settle in, let the candlelight flicker, and allow the grime of the Middle Ages to surround you, not as something shocking, but as something deeply human, the dirt and sweat of lives once lived.
Streets without sewers. The day begins not with the smell of fresh air, but with the familiar, complex aroma of the town waking up. You open the wooden shutter of your small window and look down onto the narrow cobbled lane below. The light is a flacked, weak gray, filtering between the overhanging upper stories of the houses which nearly touch across the street. The street itself is not a flat, clean surface. It is a shallow U-shaped trench designed with a central channel known as a kennel running down the middle. This is your town's sewer. It is not a hidden underground pipe, but an open gutter, a slow-moving timeline of the town's daily life. This morning, as with every morning, it is already active. A thin trickle of dark, murky water carrying kitchen scraps and yesterday's rainwater makes its sluggish way over the uneven stones. You watch as a neighbor from across the lane empties a bucket of washwater, adding a surge of gray, sudsy liquid to the flow.
The street is a landscape of refuse. The cobblestones are slick with a permanent film of slime and grime. In the corners, where the kennel meets the building fronts, are piles of decomposing garbage, vegetable peelings, oyster shells, old rags, and the bones from last night's supper. The town has regulations about keeping the space in front of your own house clear, but they are loosely enforced and widely ignored. The easiest way to dispose of something is to simply toss it into the street, where it joins the great communal midden. You prepare to leave your dwelling. You do not put on clean, pristine shoes. You put on thick leather pattens or clogs, small wooden platforms that elevate your feet an inch or two above the filth. To walk directly on the stones would be to invite the street's muck to soak into your shoes and the hem of your tunic. As you step outside, the smell intensifies. It is a rich, earthy, and deeply unpleasant bouquet. The sour smell of stale beer from the tavern next door, the sharp tang of animal manure, the sweet, cloying scent of rotting vegetables, and the underlying pervasive smell of damp and decay. It is the signature perfume of your town, an odor so constant that you have become largely accustomed to it. You breathe it in as you breathe air.
You begin to walk, your wooden pattens making a hollow clacking sound on the stones. You walk with a careful, practiced gait, your eyes constantly scanning the ground ahead to avoid the deepest puddles and the most disgusting piles of refuse. The kennel in the center of the street gurgles lazily, its contents thick and slow. In the summer, the buzz of flies around it is a constant low hum. In the winter, the filth freezes into treacherous, lumpy ridges of ice. You pass a horse, tethered to a post, which adds a stream of fresh, steaming urine to the central channel. A stray pig snuffles happily in a pile of garbage, its snout covered in filth. This is not a scene of unusual squalor. This is simply the street. It is the artery of the town, and like any artery, it carries the waste products of the body it serves. There is no concept of a hidden underground sanitation system. The life of the town, in all its messy, smelly reality, is on public display, flowing slowly down the gutter in the middle of the street.
The chamber pot problem. The sun has not yet risen, but the town is stirring. You are woken by a familiar sound, a sound that is as much a part of the urban morning as the crowing of a distant rooster. It is the cry of "Gardello! Watch out for the water!" echoing down the narrow lane. It is a shout of courtesy, a brief warning before the inevitable happens. You hear the creak of a wooden shutter opening, followed by the sound of a large volume of liquid splashing onto the cobblestones below. Another household has just emptied its chamber pot. Your own home, like every home in the town, is equipped with this essential piece of furniture. It is a simple ceramic or metal pot kept under the bed or in a corner of the room. It is the family's indoor latrine, a repository for the night's waste. And when morning comes, it must be emptied. The most direct, efficient, and universally practiced method of doing this is to simply toss the contents out of the window and into the street below.
The Gardello cry is a gesture of consideration, but it is a fleeting one. An unwary pedestrian who does not heed the warning or react quickly enough receives a foul, unwelcome shower. The contents of the pot, a mixture of urine and feces, splash onto the street, joining the already rich stew in the central kennel. The walls of the houses are streaked and stained with the residue of 1,000 such mornings. You take your own family's chamber pot. It is heavy and sloshing. You carry it to the window, push open the wooden shutter, and peer down into the gloom. You add your own voice to the morning chorus, shouting a perfunctory warning to the empty street below. Then, with a strong flick of the wrists, you empty the pot. The contents arc through the air and land with a wet, splattering sound. You pull the pot back inside, close the shutter, and the chore is done. This practice is the source of endless conflict and complaint. Neighbors argue about who is being careless, whose wall has been soiled. Town councils occasionally pass ordinances decreeing that waste must be carried down and disposed of more carefully, but these laws are almost impossible to enforce. The simple, convenient logic of the open window is too powerful to overcome.
The problem is not just one of aesthetics or smell. It is a profound public health issue, though you do not understand it in those terms. You see sickness as a result of bad air or divine will, not as a consequence of living in an environment saturated with human waste. The filth that rains down from the windows seeps into the ground, contaminating the wells from which you draw your drinking water. It provides a fertile breeding ground for flies, which then land on your food. It is a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of contamination. The chamber pot is a symbol of the medieval town's fundamental sanitation paradox. It represents an attempt at personal indoor cleanliness, a way to avoid a trip to an outdoor privy in the middle of the night. But this small, private convenience creates a massive public problem. The desire to keep the filth out of your own room leads directly to the decision to put it in everyone else's street. And so every morning, the air is filled with the warning cries and the sound of splashing as the town collectively showers itself in its own waste.
Public latrines and privies. While the chamber pot serves the needs of the night, the day requires other solutions.
For the common townsperson, the primary destination for relief is the public privy. This is not a place of comfort or privacy. It is a purely functional structure, built with a grim acceptance of its unpleasant purpose. A typical town privy is a small, rickety wooden shed built over a deep, earth-dug pit. Inside, there is no individual stall, no door for privacy. There is simply a long, rough-hewn wooden plank with a series of circular holes cut into it. It is a communal bench designed for multiple users to sit side by side, their business a shared public affair. Conversation is not uncommon. The privy is a strange, malodorous social space. The smell is the first and most powerful impression. It is an overwhelming, eye-watering stench of human waste, a smell that has seeped into the very wood of the structure and the earth around it. The pit below is a festering, decomposing mass, a home to swarms of flies and other insects. The air is thick and foul, and you learn to breathe shallowly through your mouth to minimize the assault on your senses.
These public privies are often built in convenient but hygienically disastrous locations. They might be placed directly over a river or a stream, the waste dropping directly into the water that your downstream neighbors will use for washing and drinking. A more sophisticated version, like the ones found on London Bridge, was a series of overhanging structures from which the waste dropped into the River Thames below, a constant source of both relief for the user and pollution for the city. In a castle or a monastery, the privy is known as a garderobe. This sounds more elegant, but the principle is the same. It is a small stone room or closet often built into the thickness of the outer wall, with a stone or wooden seat over a vertical shaft. The shaft empties out at the base of the castle wall, often into the moat. The smell from the shaft, especially on a warm day, can drift back up, making the garderobe a deeply unpleasant place to linger. The name garderobe comes from the belief that the powerful ammonia fumes from the urine would help to kill fleas and moths in the clothes that were sometimes stored in these small chambers. For the poorest peasants in the countryside, there is no dedicated structure at all. There is simply a designated dung heap or midden at a slight distance from the house. This is a multi-purpose pile of animal manure, kitchen scraps, and human waste, which will eventually be used as fertilizer for the fields. Privacy is found behind a bush or a tree.
The experience of using any of these facilities is a lesson in medieval reality. There is no toilet paper. You use what is at hand. This might be a handful of moss, hay, grass, or, if you are fortunate, a scrap of old cloth. Cleanliness is a relative concept. The goal is not to be sterile, but to be functional. The privy, in all its forms, is a stark reminder of the medieval approach to waste. It is something to be removed from the immediate vicinity, but there's little concept of treating it or containing it in a way that would prevent the spread of disease. It is simply moved from one place to another, out of sight, but never truly out of mind. Its lingering, powerful smell, a constant feature of the medieval landscape.
Bathhouses, pleasure and suspicion. Contrary to the popular myth of the unwashed medieval peasant, people in the earlier Middle Ages did bathe, and they often did so with great enthusiasm. The institution that catered to this need was the public bathhouse, or stew. These were not just places to get clean. They were vibrant, central hubs of social life, much like the Roman baths they were descended from. A typical town bathhouse was a bustling, steamy, and noisy place. You would pay a small fee to the keeper and enter a world dedicated to warmth and water. The main feature was a series of large wooden tubs filled with hot water, painstakingly heated in great cauldrons over a fire. Patrons would sit in these tubs, often several people to a tub, soaking in the welcome heat. It was a place of business and pleasure. Merchants would conduct deals while soaking in a tub. Friends would gather to gossip and exchange news.
Food and drink, especially wine and ale, were often served to the bathers on floating wooden trays. Musicians might play in a corner, adding a festive atmosphere to the scene. The bathhouse was the town's living room, a place to relax, socialize, and escape the cold, damp misery of the outside world.
Hygiene was part of the experience, but not its sole purpose. Attendants were on hand to provide a vigorous scrub with harsh, lye-based soap and a rough cloth. Barbers were also present, offering shaves, haircuts, and basic medical procedures like bloodletting or tooth pulling. The bathhouse was a one-stop shop for personal maintenance and social interaction. However, the reputation of the bathhouses was often mixed. Their association with leisure, food, drink, and the mingling of scantily clad bodies meant that they were frequently seen by the church as dens of sin and debauchery. Prostitution was a common and often officially tolerated feature of many bathhouses, which further cemented their reputation as morally dubious establishments. But the real decline of the bathhouse culture came not from moral condemnation, but from fear. As the Black Death swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, a new medical theory began to take hold. Doctors started to believe that water, particularly hot water, was dangerous. They theorized that bathing opened up the pores of the skin, creating an entryway for the bad air, or miasma, which they believed caused the plague. Submerging the body in a public tub, sharing the water with dozens of other people, came to be seen as a form of reckless self-exposure to disease. This fear, combined with the church's long-standing moral objections, led to the slow decline and eventual closure of most public bathhouses by the late Middle Ages. The social institution that had been the primary venue for full-body washing for centuries largely disappeared. The memory of the bathhouse lingered, but it was transformed. It became a symbol not of cleanliness and community, but of sin and sickness. The simple pleasure of a hot bath, once a common part of urban life, became a rare, private, and often suspect activity. The closing of the stews marked a major turning point in the history of hygiene, a shift away from communal washing and towards a deep-seated, medically sanctioned fear of water.
The fear of water. In the modern mind, water is synonymous with cleanliness. To wash is to use water. In the later Middle Ages, particularly after the devastation of the plague, this fundamental connection was broken. A profound and pervasive fear of water took hold, not just among the ignorant peasantry, but among the educated elite and the medical establishment. Water was not seen as a cleanser, but as a danger, a Trojan horse that could carry disease directly into the body. This belief was rooted in the prevailing medical theory of the time. Doctors believed that the human body was a porous vessel, its skin a protective barrier against the hostile outside world. They theorized that disease was caused by miasmas, or bad airs, foul-smelling vapors that rose from swamps, decaying matter, and other unsanitary places. The greatest fear was that these poisonous miasmas could penetrate the skin and enter the body, causing sickness and death. Bathing, especially in hot water, was seen as the greatest possible risk. The heat and the water, it was believed, would open up the body's pores, leaving it soft, vulnerable, and undefended. An open pore was like an unlocked door, an invitation for the deadly miasmas to enter and wreak havoc on the body's internal humors. To submerge oneself in a bath was to willingly lower one's defenses against the invisible poisons that filled the air.
This fear was not just theoretical, it was reinforced by observation. People noticed that sickness often seemed to spread in the hot, humid summer months, a time when foul smells were at their worst. They saw that epidemics could sweep through a town, and the crowded, steamy environment of a public bathhouse seemed like an obvious place for such a contagion to spread. They were not wrong about the location, but they were wrong about the cause. They blamed the water and the open pores, not the fleas, the lice, or the lack of sanitation. As a result, full-body immersion in water became a rare and often dreaded event. People actively avoided it. A thick layer of dirt and dried sweat on the skin was not seen as unhygienic. It was seen as a protective layer, a natural armor that helped to seal the pores and keep the dangerous outside world at bay. To be clean, in the sense of having washed skin, was to be vulnerable.
This does not mean people never used water. They did, but in a very limited and cautious way. They would wash their hands and face, the parts of the body that were publicly visible. This was a dry wash, often using a damp cloth and a basin of water, without fully soaking the skin. The focus was on the appearance of cleanliness, not on the removal of dirt from the entire body. This fear of water fundamentally reshaped European attitudes toward hygiene for centuries. The act of bathing, which had been a social and pleasurable activity, became associated with risk, sickness, and folly. The move away from water was not a sign of a descent into barbarism. It was a rational decision based on the best, albeit deeply flawed, medical science of the day. It was a misguided attempt to stay healthy in a world filled with terrifying and inexplicable diseases.
Washing without soap. With full-body bathing viewed with suspicion, the concept of personal cleanliness did not disappear, but it was transformed. It became a dry affair, a collection of techniques and rituals designed to maintain an appearance of cleanliness and to control odor without resorting to the perceived dangers of water immersion. Soap, as we know it, existed, but it was a harsh, lye-based substance more suited for laundry than for skin. Personal washing was a gentler, more abrasive, and far less effective process. The primary tool for daily hygiene was a basin of water, a jug, and a piece of linen cloth. Your morning ritual would not involve a shower or a bath, but a careful, localized wash. You would pour a small amount of water into the basin. You would dip the linen cloth into the water and use it to wash your face, your neck, and your hands, the parts of you that were visible to the world. This was a perfunctory, functional act. For the rest of the body, the approach was different. The belief was that vigorous rubbing was the key to cleanliness. You would use a dry or slightly damp piece of rough linen cloth to scrub your body, a process known as dry washing or frication. The goal was to remove the visible dirt and to stimulate the skin, which was thought to be healthy. This abrasive scrubbing would exfoliate the outer layer of dead skin and grime, creating an illusion of cleanliness. It was a way of polishing the body, not of washing it.
To enhance this process, various scented preparations were used. The water in the basin would often be infused with herbs, like rosemary, lavender, or mint. These were not chosen for any antibacterial properties, but for their pleasant smell. They were designed to perfume the skin, to mask any underlying body odors with a more socially acceptable fragrance. After washing your hands, you might rinse them in a bowl of rose water, a common practice for the wealthy that left a lingering floral scent. Soap was used sparingly on the body. The common soap was a harsh concoction of animal fat and wood ash, lye, which was highly alkaline and would strip the skin of its natural oils, leaving it dry and irritated. It was primarily a laundry agent.
Finer, more expensive soaps, like Castile soap made from olive oil, were available to the very wealthy, but they were a rare luxury, used more like a solid perfume than a cleanser. The focus was on the social aspects of cleanliness. Clean hands and a clean face were important, because they were signs of good breeding and respect for others, especially before a meal. It was common practice for guests at a feast to be offered a basin of scented water and a towel to wash their hands before eating, a ritual that was as much about courtesy as it was about hygiene. This approach to washing created a specific kind of physical state. A medieval person's skin was likely covered in a permanent thin layer of grime and sweat, which was periodically scoured and polished with a dry cloth. Their body odor would have been a constant presence, masked to varying degrees by the application of perfumed waters and herbs. They were not clean in the modern sense of the word, but in their own minds they were performing the necessary rituals to maintain a socially acceptable level of personal hygiene in a world that had taught them to be deeply suspicious of water.
Teeth and breath. In a world without modern dentistry, a healthy set of teeth was a rare and precious gift, and a sweet-smelling breath was an almost unattainable ideal. Dental hygiene was a mixture of rudimentary mechanical cleaning, fragrant but ineffective rinses, and ultimately a grim acceptance of decay and tooth loss. The medieval mouth was a landscape of pain, perfume, and missing pieces. The primary tool for cleaning teeth was not a brush, but a piece of cloth. After a meal, you might take a rough square of linen or wool and vigorously rub your teeth and gums. The goal was to remove the visible food particles and to polish the surface of the teeth. This abrasive action would have had some limited effect, but it could not reach the spaces between the teeth or below the gum line where decay begins. Another common practice was the use of chew sticks. These were small twigs, often from trees like hazel or oak, which were believed to have beneficial properties. You would chew on the end of the twig until the fibers frayed, creating a crude brush-like instrument, which you would then use to scrub your teeth. This was a slightly more effective method of mechanical cleaning, but still a far cry from a modern toothbrush.
To combat the ever-present problem of bad breath, people relied on masking agents. The mouth was a primary source of foul odors, a result of poor dental hygiene, rotting food trapped between the teeth, and systemic diseases. The solution was not to eliminate the cause of the smell, but to cover it up with something stronger and more pleasant. You would rinse your mouth with wine or a dilution of vinegar, the acidity and alcohol providing a brief, fresh-feeling sensation. More commonly, you would chew on fragrant herbs and spices. Parsley, mint, and cloves were popular choices. You would keep a small supply of these on your person and chew on them throughout the day, particularly before engaging in close conversation. These did nothing to clean the teeth, but they would temporarily perfume the breath, a small act of courtesy to those around you. Despite these efforts, dental disease was rampant. The diet, while not as high in sugar as the modern diet, still contained enough carbohydrates and abrasive particles from stone-ground flour to cause significant wear and decay. Abscesses were a common and excruciatingly painful affliction. With no effective treatment, an infected tooth would be a source of chronic, agonizing pain until it either fell out on its own or was pulled.
Tooth pulling was not performed by a dentist, but by a barber surgeon or even a blacksmith. It was a brutal, terrifying procedure, performed without anesthetic, using crude iron pliers. The risk of breaking the jaw or causing a fatal infection was high. As a result, many people simply endured the pain of a rotten tooth for as long as possible. Consequently, tooth loss was an accepted part of aging. It was not uncommon for a person in their 30s or 40s to have lost a significant number of their teeth. The sunken-cheeked, gap-toothed look that we associate with old age would have been a common sight in much younger people. The absence of teeth was simply another one of the many hardships of medieval life, and a sweet, fresh breath was a luxury that few could ever hope to achieve.
Hair and lice. Hair in the Middle Ages was both a symbol of status and a constant source of trouble. For women, long, elaborately braided hair was a mark of beauty and femininity. For men, a well-kept head of hair and a trimmed beard were signs of good grooming. But hair was also the perfect habitat for one of the most persistent and unwelcome companions of medieval life, the louse. The battle against lice was a relentless and largely unsuccessful war waged with combs, chemicals, and coverings. Lice were not seen as a sign of exceptional filthiness. They were an accepted, if unpleasant, fact of life. The crowded living conditions, the infrequent washing of both bodies and clothes, and the sharing of beds and blankets meant that almost everyone, from the lowest peasant to the highest noble, was likely to have lice at some point. The primary weapon in this war was the comb. Combs were made from wood, bone, or ivory, and they were often double-sided. One side had coarse teeth for detangling and styling the hair, while the other had very fine, closely spaced teeth designed specifically for removing lice and their eggs, or nits. Knitting was a common and essential part of personal grooming. You would sit for hours, patiently and methodically, combing through your own hair, or, more commonly, the hair of a family member, scraping the tiny parasites and the resilient eggs from the hair shafts. It was a bonding ritual, an act of intimate, practical care.
Various chemical concoctions were also used in an attempt to kill the lice. These were often harsh and toxic. Rinses made with herbs like stinkweed or infusions containing mercury or arsenic were sometimes applied to the hair. These might have killed some of the lice, but they were also poisonous to the person using them and could cause skin irritation, hair loss, and other health problems. For most people, the most effective strategy was not eradication, but containment. This is one of the primary reasons why head coverings were so ubiquitous in the Middle Ages. For women, the wimple, the veil, and the coif were not just symbols of modesty. They were practical tools for keeping the hair clean and contained, and for preventing the transfer of lice from one person to another. By keeping their hair braided and tightly covered, women could minimize infestations and maintain a tidy appearance. Men, too, frequently wore hats or coifs. Washing the hair was an infrequent event. When it was done, it was often with harsh, lye-based soap, which would have stripped the hair of its natural oils. More commonly, people would use herbal rinses or dry powders, like powdered iris root, which were believed to clean the hair and give it a pleasant scent, but would have done little to remove dirt or kill lice. The battle against lice was a constant, low-level struggle. You could spend an entire afternoon meticulously combing your child's hair, only to have them become reinfested within a day by playing with another child. The itchiness, the social embarrassment, and the sheer creepy-crawly unpleasantness of a louse infestation were a familiar part of the medieval sensory world. It was a small but persistent misery, a reminder that your own body was a landscape that you are forced to share with other, unwelcome inhabitants. Clothes as the first layer of hygiene. In a culture that was deeply suspicious of washing the body, clothing took on a new and profoundly important role in the concept of hygiene. The primary way to be clean was not to wash your skin, but to wear clean clothes. The linen shift or shirt, worn directly against the body, was seen as the first and most important layer of personal cleanliness. It was the garment that absorbed the sweat, the grime, and the odors of the body, protecting the more valuable and harder to clean outer garments. This idea was rooted in the medical understanding of the time. It was believed that linen had special, almost magical properties. It was a pure, white, plant-based fiber, and it was thought to be able to draw the vapors and impurities out of the body. To put on a clean linen shirt was seen as a way of purifying oneself, of drawing off the filth of the previous day. The shirt became dirty, but the body, it was believed, became cleaner. This meant that, for those who could afford it, changing the linen undergarment was a daily ritual. A nobleman or a wealthy merchant would have a large supply of linen shirts. Each morning, he would remove the previous day's soiled shirt and put on a fresh, clean one. The visible signs of cleanliness, the crisp white collar and cuffs peeking out from beneath the woolen tunic, were powerful status symbols. It was a way of demonstrating to the world that you were wealthy enough to afford a large wardrobe of linen and the laundry services required to maintain it.
For the vast majority of the population, however, a large supply of linen was an unattainable luxury. A peasant might own only 1 or 2 linen shirts. Clean for them meant washing that single shirt periodically in cold water with harsh soap and wearing it until it was so soiled that it had to be washed again. The concept of a fresh shirt every day was a fantasy. The outer garments, the woolen tunics, the heavy cloaks, were washed very infrequently, if at all. Wool was difficult to wash, prone to shrinking and losing its shape. It was also a natural repellent of dirt and water. The primary method of cleaning these garments was to brush them vigorously to remove surface dirt and to air them out, in the hope that the wind would carry away the worst of the smells. The linen undergarment was what protected these valuable outer layers from the direct contamination of the body. This focus on clothing created a specific kind of hygiene. A person could be considered clean and well-groomed if they were wearing a clean linen collar, even if the body beneath it had not been washed for weeks. The shirt acted as a kind of sponge, a disposable layer that contained the body's filth. This belief system helps to explain the seeming paradox of medieval hygiene. People were not simply wallowing in filth out of ignorance or laziness. They had a complex and internally consistent theory of cleanliness. But it was a theory that was focused on fabric rather than flesh. The first line of defense against the dirt and odors of the body was not water, but a simple, clean, white linen shirt.
Perfume, herbs, and scented gloves. In a world where foul odors were a constant and unavoidable feature of daily life, the management of smell was a primary social and hygienic concern. The goal was not to eliminate the source of a bad smell, but to mask it, to overwhelm it with a stronger, more pleasant fragrance. Medieval hygiene was, in many ways, an olfactory art form, a constant battle of scent against stench, fought with the weapons of perfume, herbs, and aromatic accessories. The use of personal perfume was a sign of wealth and sophistication. Perfumes were not the light, alcohol-based sprays of today, but heavy, oil-based concoctions, often in the form of a solid pomade or unguent. They were made from expensive and exotic imported ingredients like musk from the glands of the musk deer, ambergris, a waxy substance from the intestines of sperm whales, and civet from the glands of the civet cat. These powerful, animalistic scents were blended with floral essences like rose and lavender to create complex, long-lasting fragrances. You would rub a small amount of this pomade onto your wrists and neck, creating a personal cloud of scent that would follow you throughout the day. For those who could not afford such luxuries, the more common solution was the use of herbs. People would carry small cloth bags or sachets filled with dried, fragrant herbs like lavender, rosemary, chamomile, and cloves. These would be tucked into their clothes or hung from a belt, releasing a pleasant scent as they moved. A posy of fresh flowers or herbs might be carried in the hand to be held up to the nose when passing a particularly smelly part of the town.
The home, too, was a battleground of smells. The floors were strewn with sweet-smelling herbs like meadowsweet and mint, mixed in with the rushes, When walked upon, these herbs would release their fragrance, helping to combat the underlying smell of damp and decay. Bunches of herbs were hung from the rafters. Incense, particularly frankincense and myrrh, was burned not just in churches, but in private homes. Its thick, resinous smoke thought to purify the air of both evil spirits and foul odors. One of the most characteristic accessories of the wealthy was the scented glove. Leather gloves were treated with fragrant oils and perfumes, a process that took weeks. To wear these gloves was to be constantly surrounded by a pleasant aroma. When greeting someone, you would remove the glove and offer a perfumed hand, a gesture of both courtesy and olfactory superiority. A pomander was another common personal accessory. It was a small, ornate metal ball, often made of silver or gold, which was filled with a mixture of solid perfume, spices, and herbs. It was hung from a chain around the neck or from a belt, and it could be held to the nose as a personal, portable air freshener, a defense against the miasmas and stenches of the street. All of these practices were based on a single principle: addition, not subtraction. You did not remove the bad smell of sweat or garbage. You added a good smell on top of it. The medieval sensory world was not one of neutrality, but one of competing, overlapping, and often overwhelming smells. To be a well-groomed person was not to be odorless, but to be the master of your own personal scent, to project an aura of pleasant fragrance that could successfully conquer the ever-present stench of the world around you.
Animals in the streets. The medieval town was not just a home for people, it was a home for a vast and diverse population of animals. The modern distinction between the urban and the rural, between the human space and the animal space, did not exist. Animals were an integral, essential, and deeply messy part of city life. The streets were a shared space, a chaotic and noisy barnyard that was home to far more than just human footprints. The most common and most problematic of these urban animals was the pig. Pigs were the city's living garbage disposal units. They were allowed to roam freely through the streets, snuffling and foraging in the piles of refuse in the open gutters. They consumed the filth that would otherwise fester, converting it into valuable meat. They were a practical and efficient part of the urban ecosystem. They were also a constant nuisance. They were noisy, aggressive, and utterly indifferent to human traffic. They would block narrow lanes, knock over market stalls, and occasionally even attack small children. Their constant presence meant that the streets were littered not just with garbage, but with a generous layer of pig manure. Chickens, geese, and ducks also roamed freely, scratching in the dirt, leaving their droppings everywhere, and adding their clucking and squawking to the general din. Almost every household would have kept a few chickens for their eggs, and these birds were simply let out into the street each morning to forage for themselves.
Horses were the engines of the medieval economy. They pulled the heavy carts that brought goods into the city, they carried merchants and messengers, and they were the mounts of the wealthy and the military. The streets were filled with the clatter of their iron-shod hooves, and wherever there were horses, there was horse manure. A busy street would be dotted with fresh piles of dung, which would be flattened and spread by the passage of carts and pedestrians, becoming a major component of the thick brown mud that coated the cobblestones. Dogs, both stray and owned, were everywhere. They acted as scavengers, guards, and companions. They barked and they fought, and they contributed their own waste to the streets. Even livestock destined for the butcher was a common sight. Herds of cattle or sheep would be driven directly through the center of town to the slaughterhouses, a chaotic and messy procession that brought the sounds, smells, and filth of the farm into the heart of the city.
The presence of so many animals created a unique sensory environment. The air was filled with a constant symphony of animal sounds. The squealing of pigs, the crowing of roosters, the barking of dogs, the whinnying of horses. The smell was equally complex. A rich blend of different types of manure, the musky scent of wet feathers and fur, and the occasional coppery smell of blood from the butcher's district. This cohabitation of humans and animals was not a matter of choice, it was a matter of necessity. In a world without refrigeration or long-distance transport, the food supply had to be kept close at hand. The animals in the streets were a walking larder, a source of power, and a vital part of the town's economy. But they were also a constant source of filth, noise, and chaos, ensuring that the medieval street was a place that belonged as much to the beasts as it did to the people.
Water sources and contamination. Water is the most essential ingredient for life, and in a medieval town, securing a supply of it was a constant and often hazardous endeavor. The town was a thirsty place, needing water for drinking, cooking, brewing, washing, and a host of industrial processes like tanning and dyeing. But the sources of this vital liquid were often dangerously close to the sources of the town's filth, leading to a system of routine and catastrophic contamination. The primary source of water from most towns was the river or stream that it was built upon. The river was the town's lifeblood, but it was also its toilet and its garbage dump. Upstream from the main drinking water collection points, the river was already likely to be contaminated by runoff from fields and waste from smaller upstream villages. But the real damage happened within the town itself. The river was seen as the most convenient place to dispose of all manner of waste. Public latrines were often built directly over it. Tanners, whose work involved soaking animal hides in foul-smelling and toxic solutions, would dump their used vats directly into the current. Butchers would wash blood and offal into the river. Dyers would release vats of colored, chemical-laden water. The contents of chamber pots and the filth from the streets would eventually find their way into the river. The same body of water was simultaneously used as a sewer and a reservoir.
People would collect their drinking water from this contaminated source. They might have designated collection points or conduits where water was piped from a supposedly cleaner part of the river, but cross-contamination was inevitable. They knew on some level that the water was not pure. They would try to collect it from the faster-moving parts of the stream, believing that running water purified itself. They would let the water sit in a bucket to allow the sediment to settle before drinking it. But they had no knowledge of the invisible dangers, the bacteria and the viruses that thrived in the water. The town well was another common source of water. A deep well could provide cleaner water, filtered by the earth, but wells too were highly susceptible to contamination. They were often located in the center of town, in a courtyard or a marketplace, surrounded by the filth of the streets. The waste that soaked into the ground, the animal manure, the human excrement, the rotting garbage, could easily seep into the groundwater and contaminate the well. A well situated near a churchyard was particularly dangerous, as the decomposing bodies could leach contaminants into the water supply.
For the wealthy, there was sometimes a more sophisticated solution. A system of lead pipes, a legacy of Roman engineering, might bring water from a clean spring outside the town directly into the kitchens of a castle or a monastery. This was a rare and expensive luxury, a private source of clean water that set the elite apart from the common people who were forced to drink from the communal and often poisoned sources. The result of this constant contamination was a host of waterborne diseases. Dysentery, cholera, and typhoid were common and often fatal afflictions. A medieval person was in a constant, low-level state of gastrointestinal distress. They were accustomed to a life of stomach cramps and diarrhea. They did not connect this sickness to the water they drank. They saw it as a normal part of life, an imbalance of the humors or a punishment from God. But the true culprit was in the bucket they carried from the river each morning, the clear but deadly water that was both the source of their life and the cause of their suffering.
Rural hygiene habits. Life in the countryside was a world away from the crowded, concentrated filth of the town. For the peasant, life was lived in close, intimate contact with the earth, the seasons, and the animals. This did not necessarily make their lives cleaner, but it made their relationship with dirt and hygiene fundamentally different. The challenges were less about human pollution and more about the simple, all-encompassing reality of agricultural life. A peasant's home was not a clean, sealed environment. It was a simple structure of wood, wattle, and daub with an earthen floor and a thatched roof. It was a permeable building, open to the drafts, the damp, and the dirt of the outside world. The floor was a mixture of packed earth, straw, and the accumulated grime of daily life. The air was thick with wood smoke from the central hearth. Cleanliness, in the modern sense, was an impossible and irrelevant concept. Personal washing was a practical and infrequent affair. The peasant family did not have a private well. Their water source was the same one used by their animals, the local stream, a pond, or a spring. This water was likely to be cleaner than the rivers of the towns, as it was not contaminated with industrial waste or the sewage of a large population, but it was still far from pure. The same stream that provided their drinking water was also where the family would wash their clothes, where they would bathe, and where their livestock would drink and defecate.
Bathing, for a peasant, was a rare seasonal event. In the hot summer months, the entire family might go down to the local stream to wash. It was a functional, public, and unsophisticated act, more about cooling off and removing the thickest layers of sweat and dirt than about achieving a state of true cleanliness. There was no soap, only the abrasive action of a rough cloth or a handful of sand from the riverbed. For the rest of the year, washing was likely limited to a quick rinse of the hands and face from a bucket of cold water outside the hut. The peasant's life was one of constant physical labor in the fields. They were perpetually covered in a layer of soil, sweat, and grime. This was not seen as filth, but as the normal and honorable patina of hard work. Their hands were calloused and ingrained with dirt. Their feet, often bare in the summer, were tough and permanently stained. Waste disposal was simple and direct. Human waste was added to the midden heap, along with the animal manure and household scraps. This pile, located a short distance from the hut, was a valuable resource, the source of the fertilizer that was essential for the next year's crops. The peasant lived in a closed-loop system of consumption and decomposition. There was no concept of getting rid of waste. It was simply transformed and reused.
The greatest hygiene challenge in the countryside was the close proximity to animals. Peasants often shared their small huts with their livestock, especially in winter, to protect the animals and to benefit from their body heat. To sleep in the same room as a cow or a pig was a common and practical reality. This meant that the living space was shared not just with the animals themselves, but with their waste, their smells, and their parasites. Fleas, lice, and other vermin were a constant and accepted part of life. The peasant's world was not a clean one. It was a world of earth, of sweat, of manure, and of a deep, unavoidable intimacy with the cycles of nature. It was a different kind of dirt from that of the city, less concentrated, less man-made, but just as profound. Urban stench.
To walk through a medieval city would be, for a modern person, an overwhelming olfactory experience. The air was not a neutral medium, but a thick, heavy, and complex tapestry of smells, the vast majority of them unpleasant. The urban stench was the city's defining characteristic, a constant, pervasive presence that shaped the lives and the health of its inhabitants. The primary source of the stench was decay. In a world without refrigeration or efficient waste disposal, everything was in a constant state of decomposition. The streets were filled with rotting garbage, vegetable scraps, animal bones, and other household waste, which gave off a sweet, cloying, and deeply nauseating odor, especially in the heat of summer. The open sewers, or kennels, that ran down the middle of the streets were filled with a stagnant soup of human and animal waste, which produced a powerful, eye-watering smell of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Animal life was another major contributor to the stench. The ever-present pigs, horses, and chickens filled the air with the sharp, pungent smell of their manure. The various industries of the town each added their own unique and often horrific contribution to the olfactory landscape. The tanneries, where animal hides were treated, released the foul stench of rotting flesh and the sharp chemical smell of the tanning agents. The slaughterhouses, or shambles, filled their districts with the thick, coppery smell of blood and the gut-wrenching odor of offal. Dyers released clouds of chemical-smelling fumes, while the smoke from hundreds of homes and workshops, burning wood or dirty coal, created a permanent, acrid haze.
This complex blend of smells was not evenly distributed. The city was a map of odors. You could navigate by smell alone. You knew you were approaching the shambles by the rising scent of blood. You knew you were near the docks by the smell of tar, salt, and rotting fish. The wealthiest neighborhoods, usually located upwind or on higher ground, might have been slightly less pungent, while the poorest, most crowded districts in the low-lying parts of the town were an almost unbearable concentration of stench. People were not oblivious to this smell. They were simply accustomed to it. It was the background noise of their lives. But they did take measures to try and cope with it. A wealthy person might carry a pomander, a metal ball filled with perfume, to hold to their nose when walking through a particularly foul-smelling area. A lady might carry a scented handkerchief for the same purpose. The practice of strewing sweet-smelling herbs on the floor was as much an attempt to combat the odors from the street as it was to deal with the smells inside the house.
The medieval mind did not connect the stench to the spread of disease in a scientific way, but they did make a connection. The theory of miasma held that the foul smells themselves, the bad air, were the direct cause of sickness. This was why they burned incense and herbs to purify the air. They believed that by fighting the smell, they were fighting the disease itself. To live in a medieval city was to have a sense of smell that was both highly developed and deeply dulled. You would be able to distinguish between dozens of different unpleasant odors, but you would also have a very high tolerance for a level of background stench that a modern person would find physically sickening. The air was not just something you breathed, it was something you experienced, a thick, flavorful, and constantly challenging presence.
The role of weather. The daily challenge of medieval hygiene was not a static one. It was in a constant state of flux, dictated by the most powerful and unpredictable force in medieval life, the weather. The changing seasons did not just alter the temperature, they fundamentally transformed the nature of the filth, the intensity of the smells, and the very methods of survival. Heat, frost, and rain were not just meteorological events. They were active agents in the battle for cleanliness. Summer was the season of stench and sickness. The heat acted as a powerful catalyst, accelerating the process of decay.
The garbage in the streets, the waste in the kennels, and the meat in the butcher's shambles would begin to rot almost immediately, releasing a thick, gag-inducing cloud of foul odors that would hang over the town in the hot, humid air. The heat also created the perfect breeding conditions for flies and other insects, which would swarm over the filth, their buzzing a constant summer soundtrack. This was the time of the summer sickness, when waterborne diseases like dysentery were at their most rampant. The heat made people sweat, their bodies and clothes becoming sticky and foul, but the fear of opening the pores to the bad air meant that bathing was still avoided. Summer was a time of vibrant, active, and aggressive filth.
Winter brought a different set of challenges. The coming of the first hard frost was a blessing in disguise. The cold acted as a natural preservative, halting the process of decay. The stench of the town would lessen dramatically. The piles of garbage would freeze solid, and the flies would disappear. But the cold created its own problems. The filth in the streets would turn into a treacherous, lumpy landscape of frozen muck. The open kennels would become solid rivers of ice, causing blockages and overflows. Water sources would freeze over, making the daily chore of fetching water a back-breaking ordeal of smashing through thick ice. People were sealed inside their homes, the air growing thick and stale, and the constant huddling together for warmth meant that respiratory illnesses and lice could spread with frightening speed. Winter exchanged the problem of rot for the problem of ice.
Rain was the most ambivalent of weather events. A gentle, steady rain could be a temporary cleanser. It would wash some of the filth from the cobblestones, dilute the contents of the kennels, and briefly freshen the air. But a heavy downpour was a disaster. It would turn the streets into a churning liquid bog, a river of mud and refuse that would flood cellars and make movement impossible. The dampness brought by the rain was the great enemy of hygiene. It seeped into the walls of the houses, promoting the growth of mold. It soaked into clothes and bedding, making them impossible to dry and giving them a permanent musty smell. It made the rushes on the floor a slimy, rotting mat. A prolonged period of rain would leave the entire town feeling sodden, clammy, and miserable. The weather was the ultimate arbiter of hygiene. It determined the state of the streets, the quality of the air, and the nature of the health threats. A medieval person's life was a constant adaptation to these changing conditions, a daily negotiation with the heat, the cold, and the rain, each of which presented its own unique and unpleasant set of challenges.
The theory of miasma. To understand the medieval approach to hygiene, one must first understand their theory of disease. In a world without microscopes, without any knowledge of bacteria or viruses, the causes of sickness were a profound and terrifying mystery. The most widely accepted and influential explanation for the spread of epidemic disease was the theory of miasma. This theory held that illness was not transmitted by physical contact or invisible germs, but by bad air, a poisonous, corrupt, and foul-smelling vapor that rose from the earth and a filth. Miasma was believed to be generated by any source of decay and putrefaction. It rose from stagnant swamps, from decomposing garbage, from the filth in the streets, from slaughterhouses, and most terrifyingly, from the bodies of the sick and the dead during an epidemic. This bad air was not just unpleasant, it was seen as a tangible, physical substance, a poisonous cloud that could be inhaled or even absorbed through the pores of the skin, causing a catastrophic imbalance in the body's four humors and leading to sickness and death. This theory, while incorrect, was based on observation. people correctly noticed that disease was often rampant in the most crowded, filthiest, and smelliest carts of a town. They noticed that epidemics often occurred during the hot, humid summer months when the stench of decay was at its peak. Their conclusion was a logical, if flawed, one. The smell itself was the disease. To breathe in the foul odor of a privy or a garbage heap was to breathe in the very essence of the sickness.
This belief system had a profound and often counterproductive impact on hygiene practices. The primary focus of public and personal health was not on removing the source of the filth, but on combating the smell. The fight against disease was an olfactory battle. This is why people carried pomaders filled with perfume and posies of sweet-smelling herbs. These were not just fashion accessories, they were personal air purifiers, a form of protective mask designed to create a bubble of good air around the user, warding off the dangerous miasmas. During the plague, doctors would wear masks with long beaks filled with aromatic herbs for the same reason. It is also why there was such an emphasis on fumigation. When a person was sick, their room would be filled with the smoke from burning incense, juniper, or rosemary. This was an attempt to drive out the bad air and replace it with a purified, fragrant air. Public health measures often involved lighting huge bonfires in the streets, in the belief that the heat and smoke would cleanse the atmosphere of its poisonous vapors. The miasma theory also explains the fear of bathing. If the skin was porous and could absorb the miasma, then opening the pores with hot water was seen as an act of extreme folly. A layer of dirt was seen as a protective seal. While the theory of miasma was ultimately wrong, it was not entirely useless. The focus on eliminating bad smells did sometimes lead to actions that had a positive, if accidental, effect on public health. Ordinances against dumping garbage in the streets, for example, were passed primarily to reduce the foul odors. But they also had the side effect of removing the breeding grounds for flies and other disease vectors. The theory of miasma was a flawed map of the world of disease, but it was the only map they had, and it dictated their every move in the desperate, centuries-long struggle against an invisible and terrifying enemy.
Religious views on cleanliness. In the medieval world, the church was the ultimate authority on all matters of life, death, and morality. Its teachings permeated every aspect of daily existence, and its views on cleanliness had a powerful and often contradictory influence on the hygiene habits of the people. For the medieval Christian, the concept of cleanliness was far more concerned with the state of the soul than with the state of the body. The primary focus of the church was on spiritual purity. Sin was seen as a form of spiritual filth, a stain on the soul that was far more dangerous and offensive to God than any amount of physical dirt. The rituals of the church, confession, penance, baptism, were seen as forms of spiritual washing, a way of cleansing the inner self. Baptism, for example, was a one-time, powerful act of spiritual cleansing, a washing away of original sin. Its significance was so profound that the idea of repeating the act of full-body immersion in water for mere physical reasons seemed trivial or even profane. Physical cleanliness was often viewed with suspicion, as it was associated with vanity and worldly temptation. The body was seen as a vessel of sin, a source of fleshly desires that needed to be subdued, not pampered. To spend too much time and effort on beautifying the body through elaborate washing, perfumes, and cosmetics was seen as a sign of pride, one of the 7 deadly sins. The public bathhouses, with their atmosphere of leisure, pleasure, and promiscuity, were frequently condemned from the pulpit as places that led the faithful into temptation.
This led to the rise of a particular ideal in the more ascetic strains of Christianity, the odor of sanctity. Some saints and devoutly religious figures were believed to have achieved such a state of spiritual purity that they completely neglected their physical bodies, seeing filthiness as a sign of their rejection of worldly vanities. Stories abounded of holy hermits who had not bathed in decades, their bodies covered in sores and infested with vermin, yet they were revered for their spiritual strength. For these figures, physical squalor was a badge of honor, a testament to their focus on the eternal over the temporal. However, the Church's view was not entirely anti-hygiene. There was also a strong tradition that equated physical cleanliness with godliness. Order, purity, and light were associated with the divine. Monasteries, for example, often had some of the most sophisticated water management and sanitation systems of the era. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monastic orders, prescribed regular washing of both the body and the clothes. This was not for comfort, but as a form of discipline and order, a reflection of the ordered and purified state of the monastic community.
Ritual washing also played a part in religious practice. Priests were required to wash their hands before celebrating the Mass, a symbolic act of purification before handling the sacred elements. This reinforced the idea that cleanliness was important, but primarily in a symbolic, ritual context. The overall influence of the Church was therefore complex. It de-emphasized routine, comfort-based physical washing, associating it with vanity and sin, but it simultaneously upheld an ideal of ritual and spiritual purity that sometimes manifested as a disciplined, orderly approach to physical cleanliness. For the average medieval person, the message was clear. The state of your immortal soul was of infinitely greater importance than the temporary, corruptible, and sinful state of your mortal body.
The influence of the plague. Of all the events that shaped the medieval world, none had a more profound or terrifying impact than the Black Death. The pandemic, which swept through Europe from 1347 to 1351, killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. It was an apocalyptic event that shattered society, transformed the economy, and left a deep, permanent scar on the collective psyche. Its influence on hygiene was immediate and dramatic, reinforcing existing fears and creating new ones that would last for centuries. The plague was a terrifying mystery. It arrived suddenly, spread with unimaginable speed, and killed with brutal efficiency. No one knew what caused it or how it was transmitted. In the face of such an inexplicable and overwhelming threat, people turned to the only explanatory frameworks they had: religion and the medical theory of miasma. The plague was seen as either a divine punishment for the sins of mankind or a result of a particularly virulent and widespread bad air that had poisoned the atmosphere. Both of these explanations led to a profound distrust of traditional hygiene practices, particularly bathing. From a religious perspective, the plague was a call for repentance, not for physical cleanliness. The response was not to wash the body, but to purify the soul through prayer, fasting, and processions of flagellants who would whip themselves in the streets as a form of public penance.
From a medical perspective, the plague was the ultimate confirmation of the dangers of miasma. The air itself was believed to be toxic, and the idea of opening the body's pores through bathing seemed like an act of suicide. Doctors and public officials actively warned people not to bathe. They believed that a layer of grime, sweat, and dirt, the filth armor, was a person's best defense, a natural seal that would prevent the poisonous plague vapors from entering the body. The public bathhouses, or stews, which were already viewed with moral suspicion, were now seen as death traps. They were crowded places where people would share the same water and breathe the same steamy air, making them seem like the perfect incubators for the disease. Across Europe, authorities shut them down, and the culture of communal bathing effectively came to an end.
The fear of contagion also led to a general fear of other people. The plague turned neighbors into potential sources of death. People became afraid of crowds, of physical contact, of breathing the same air as a stranger. This social atomization worked against the communal nature of the bathhouse. The idea of sitting in a tub of hot water with a group of other people, once a source of pleasure and social connection, became a terrifying prospect.
The plague did lead to some of the first organized public health responses. Authorities would order the cleaning of streets, the removal of filth, and the imposition of quarantines on infected households and incoming ships. These measures were based on the miasma theory, an attempt to reduce the bad smells, but they sometimes had the accidental benefit of reducing the rat and flea populations that were the true vectors of the disease. The legacy of the Black Death on hygiene was a long and negative one. It cemented the fear of water in the European mind. It destroyed the existing infrastructure for public bathing, and it replaced a culture of communal cleanliness with a culture of fear, suspicion, and a belief that dirt could be a form of protection. The plague taught the people of Europe that the greatest threats were invisible, and in their desperate attempt to protect themselves, they abandoned one of the most basic tools of public health.
Doctors and hygiene advice. A visit to a medieval doctor would be a strange and unsettling experience for a modern person. The doctor's understanding of the human body and the causes of disease was based not on scientific evidence, but on a complex and ancient system of philosophy inherited from the classical world. Their advice on hygiene was a direct reflection of this worldview, a mixture of sensible observations, bizarre theories, and a profound focus on balance and moderation. The foundation of medieval medicine was the theory of the four humors, first developed by the ancient Greeks Hippocrates and Galen. This theory held that the human body was composed of four fundamental liquids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A person's health and temperament were determined by the balance of these four humors. Sickness was believed to be the result of an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more of the humors. The primary goal of a doctor was not to kill a pathogen, but to restore this delicate balance. All medical advice, including advice on hygiene, was filtered through this humoral lens. The doctor would be concerned with how your daily habits affected your personal humoral balance. Bathing, for example, was a complex issue. A cold bath might be prescribed for someone with an excess of hot humors, while a hot bath would be seen as dangerous for the same person. The time of day, the season, and the person's individual constitution all had to be taken into account. For most doctors, especially after the plague, the safest advice was to avoid full-body bathing altogether, as it was a powerful intervention that could easily disrupt the body's fragile equilibrium.
Instead of bathing, doctors would recommend other methods of cleansing. They would advise a change in diet, as the foods you ate were believed to directly affect the humors. They would recommend purges, enemas, and bloodletting, all practices designed to remove an excess of a particular humor from the body. These were seen as far more direct and effective forms of internal hygiene than simply washing the skin. For external hygiene, a doctor's advice would focus on moderation and the management of air. They would strongly endorse the miasma theory, advising patients to avoid foul-smelling places and to surround themselves with pleasant aromas. They might prescribe the use of a pomander or the burning of incense as a legitimate medical intervention. Some of their advice would seem sensible to us, even if the reasoning was flawed. They would advise washing the hands before eating, not because of germs, but out of a sense of social decorum and a desire not to ingest visible filth that might upset the humors. They might recommend cleaning the teeth with a cloth,
not to prevent cavities, but to remove the foul tastes and odors that were signs of internal corruption.
Other advice would seem like pure superstition. A doctor might prescribe a talisman or an amulet to be worn around the neck to ward off the bad air. They might advise against sleeping with the windows open, even on a hot night, for fear that the night air was particularly poisonous. A consultation with a medieval doctor would reveal a worldview that was holistic, complex, and utterly alien to modern medicine. Their hygiene advice was not about killing germs or achieving sterility. It was about maintaining a delicate, precarious balance between the microcosm of the human body and the macrocosm of the world around it, a world they believed was filled with invisible forces, powerful smells, and a constant threat of humoral imbalance.
Ritual washing for the elite. While the common person's hygiene was a matter of practical, infrequent, and often ineffective routines, for the wealthy elite, cleanliness was a complex and important ritual, deeply intertwined with status, courtesy, and the performance of power. The washing practices of a king, a queen, or a high-ranking noble were not just about getting clean, they were about demonstrating their refined, civilized, and superior nature. The most visible and important of these rituals was the washing of hands. No formal meal in a noble household would begin without the ceremony of the ewer and basin. Servants would move among the guests, one carrying a highly decorated jug, or ewer, filled with perfumed water, and another carrying a matching basin to catch the drips. They would pour a small amount of the warm scented water over the hands of each guest, who would then dry them on a clean linen towel provided by another servant. This was a powerful symbol. It was a practical act, as eating was done with the hands, but it was also a demonstration of the host's wealth and hospitality. The elegance of the ewer and basin, the fragrance of the rose water, and the whiteness of the linen towel were all subtle signals of high status. The private bathing of a noble was a rare but elaborate affair. It was not a quick, functional wash, but a luxurious, sensual experience, a form of pampered leisure. A large wooden tub would be brought into the lord's private chamber and placed near the fire. It would be lined with a clean linen cloth to protect the bather from splinters. The tub would then be filled with buckets of hot water, a process that required a huge amount of labor from the kitchen staff. The bath water itself would be heavily perfumed with expensive herbs, flowers, and oils. The bather would sit in the tub, often for a long time, relaxing in the warm, fragrant water. They might be served wine and food while they soaked. Attendants would be on hand to wash them with fine, scented soap, to scrub their back, and to pour warm water over their head to rinse their hair. The entire experience was one of pleasure and indulgence. However, even for the elite, these full-body baths were infrequent events, undertaken perhaps a few times a year, or before a major occasion like a wedding or a knighting ceremony. The medical fears about opening the pores to disease were as prevalent among the wealthy as they were among the poor. More common was the daily dry wash. A noble would have a personal servant assist them with their morning toilette. A basin of scented water would be used to wash the face and hands. Their body would be rubbed with a clean, warm linen cloth. Their hair would be meticulously combed and styled. Their clothes, particularly their linen undergarments, would be fresh and clean every day. The focus for the elite was on the visible and the olfactory. They needed to look clean and to smell pleasant. Their hair, hands, face, and the linen peeking out at their collar and cuffs had to be immaculate. Their bodies were perfumed, their clothes were of the finest materials, and their breath was sweetened with spices. The hygiene of the elite was a carefully curated performance, a theatrical display designed to create a powerful aura of purity, wealth, and refinement that set them apart from the unwashed masses. Early sanitation laws.
The medieval town, with its open sewers and garbage-filled streets, was not a place without rules. On the contrary, town councils and guilds were constantly issuing regulations and ordinances in a desperate and largely futile attempt to impose some semblance of order on the urban chaos. These early sanitation laws reveal a society that was acutely aware of its own filth, even if it lacked the knowledge and the infrastructure to deal with it effectively. These laws were not based on a modern understanding of public health. They were driven by more immediate concerns: the obstruction of traffic, the foul smells, and the constant, bitter disputes between neighbors. A typical ordinance would forbid citizens from throwing their garbage or the contents of their chamber pots into the street before a certain time of day, or would require them to shout a warning. The goal was not to stop the practice, but to regulate it, to make it slightly less hazardous for passerby.
Another common type of law concerned the placement of dung heaps. Every household produced animal and human waste, and this had to be piled up somewhere. Ordinances would specify that these middens had to be a certain distance from a neighbor's property, or that they could not block a public right-of-way. These laws were the source of endless legal disputes, as one person's conveniently located dung heap was another person's foul-smelling nuisance. The most polluting industries, like butchery and tanning, were a particular focus of regulation. A town might decree that all slaughtering had to take place in a designated area, or that tanners had to set up their workshops downstream from the main part of the town. This was an early form of zoning, an attempt to concentrate the worst smells and the most noxious waste in a single, contained area away from the homes of the wealthier citizens.
The problem with all of these laws was enforcement. A medieval town did not have a professional police force or a dedicated sanitation department. Enforcement was left to a handful of elected officials, like the town bailiff or the ward alderman. They could levy small fines on offenders, but they lacked the manpower and the authority to effect any real systemic change. For every person fined for illegally dumping their garbage, there were 100 others who got away with it. Furthermore, the laws were often in conflict with the practical realities of medieval life. It was all very well to forbid a butcher from throwing blood and guts into the street, but where else was he supposed to put them? There was no municipal collection service, no landfill, no sewage treatment plant. The street, the river, the ditch outside the town walls, these were the only available options. Despite their limited success, these early sanitation laws are significant. They show that medieval people were not content to live in filth. They had a concept of public nuisance and a desire for a more orderly and pleasant urban environment. They recognized that the actions of an individual could have a negative impact on the community as a whole. These laws were the first faltering steps on a long road towards modern urban sanitation. They were a testament to a society struggling to cope with problems that it had neither the science to understand nor the technology to solve.
Monastic hygiene. In the midst of the often squalid medieval world, there existed pockets of remarkable cleanliness and order: the monasteries. Monastic communities, governed by a strict set of rules and a theological belief in order and purity, often achieved a level of hygiene that was far superior to that of the surrounding towns and countryside. For a monk, cleanliness was not a matter of comfort or vanity. It was a form of spiritual discipline. The foundation of monastic hygiene was the rule, most famously the Rule of St. Benedict. This detailed code of conduct governed every aspect of a monk's life, from prayer to work to sleep, and it often included specific injunctions regarding cleanliness. The rule might dictate how often a monk should bathe, when they should wash their clothes, and how the monastery's sanitation facilities should be maintained. This made hygiene a matter of religious obedience. The most impressive aspect of monastic hygiene was often its infrastructure. Drawing on the memory of Roman engineering, many larger monasteries had sophisticated water management systems. A conduit of lead or stone pipes might bring fresh, clean water from a distant spring directly into the monastery complex, providing a source of water that was far purer than the contaminated rivers and wells used by the general populace.
This clean water supplied various parts of the monastery. There would be a lavatorium, a dedicated washing area with a long stone trough and multiple taps, where the monks would perform their ritual hand washing before meals. There would be a well-organized laundry, where the monks' habits and linens were washed on a regular basis. And most impressively, many monasteries had a dedicated bathhouse, a facility that had all but disappeared from secular life. While bathing was still not a frequent recreational activity, it might be scheduled only a few times a year. The existence of the facility itself was a testament to a different attitude towards water. Monastic latrines, or rear daughters, were also often marvels of sanitary engineering. They were typically large, multi-seat facilities, built as a separate building, often over a running stream or a specially diverted channel of water. This created a constantly flushing system that carried the waste away from the main monastery complex, a primitive but effective form of sewage disposal that was unheard of in the nearby towns.
This focus on hygiene was driven by a combination of theological belief and practical necessity. Theologically, order and cleanliness were seen as a reflection of the divine order of God's creation. A clean and well-ordered monastery was a tribute to God. Practically, the monks lived in a close communal environment. The abbots and priors understood that sickness could spread rapidly through the community, disrupting the vital routines of prayer and work. Good sanitation was a way of preserving the health and functioning of the monastic body. This is not to say that monasteries were perfectly sterile environments. The monks still battled with lice, fleas, and the diseases of the era. But their disciplined lifestyle, their access to cleaner water, and their superior sanitation systems meant that they were often healthier and lived longer than their secular counterparts. The monastery was an island of order and hygiene in a sea of medieval filth, a place where the connection between cleanliness, discipline, and well-being was uniquely understood. Hygiene in warfare. If daily life in a medieval town or castle presented a formidable hygiene challenge, life on a military campaign was a descent into a world of concentrated, unrelenting filth. A medieval army was a city on the move, a vast, temporary community that carried with it all the sanitation problems of a town, but without any of the permanent infrastructure. For the common soldier, the battle against the enemy was often secondary to the battle against mud, lice, and disease. The military camp was the heart of the problem. It was a hastily erected settlement, often occupied for weeks or months at a time. There were no sewers, no proper latrines, no organized system of waste disposal. The camp was set up on open ground, and this ground quickly became a churned-up, foul-smelling quagmire. Thousands of men and horses living in close quarters produced a staggering amount of waste. The ground would be littered with human and animal excrement, food scraps, and the offal from slaughtered animals. Latrines, if they existed at all, were simply deep pits or cess trenches dug at the edge of the camp. These would quickly overflow, the contents seeping into the surrounding soil and contaminating any nearby water sources. More often than not, soldiers would simply relieve themselves wherever was convenient. The entire camp would acquire a powerful, gag-inducing stench.
Water was a constant source of danger. The army would draw its water from whatever source was at hand, a river, a stream, a pond.
This water was almost certainly contaminated, either by the army's own waste or by the filth from a nearby town. Drinking this water was a recipe for dysentery, a condition known as the bloody flux, which could sweep through a camp with devastating speed, incapacitating or killing more soldiers than enemy action. Personal hygiene was a near impossibility. There was no opportunity to wash. Soldiers would wear the same woolen and leather clothes for weeks on end, sleeping in them, fighting in them, marching in them. These clothes would become saturated with sweat, dirt, rain, and often blood. They were a perfect breeding ground for lice, which were a universal torment for the medieval soldier. The soldier's itch was a constant, maddening affliction. The food was monotonous and often spoiled. Rations consisted of hard biscuits, salted meat, and whatever could be foraged from the local countryside. These supplies were often poorly stored and transported, and were susceptible to rot and infestation. The result of these conditions was that disease was the single greatest killer in most medieval military campaigns. A general who lost half his army to sickness before even reaching the battlefield was not uncommon. The crowded, unsanitary, and stressful environment of the camp was the perfect incubator for epidemics. For the common soldier, life was a state of perpetual discomfort and filth. They were cold, wet, itchy, and often suffering from diarrhea. Their world was one of mud, manure, and the constant, imminent threat of sickness. The noble knight, in his shining armor, might present an image of military glory, but the reality for the vast majority of soldiers was a grim, smelly, and deeply unhygienic struggle for survival.
The first steps toward modern cleanliness. The deep-seated fear of water and the hygiene habits of the Middle Ages did not vanish overnight. But as the medieval period gave way to the Renaissance and the early modern era, the first tentative steps towards a new understanding of cleanliness began to be taken. This was not a sudden revolution, but a slow, gradual shift in attitudes driven by changing social, cultural, and scientific ideas. One of the key drivers of this change was the Renaissance itself. The renewed interest in the art, literature, and philosophy of the classical world brought with it a renewed interest in the Roman attitude towards bathing. Scholars read the texts of ancient writers who described the magnificent public baths of Rome, and the elite began to see bathing not just as a medical issue, but as a sign of a refined, civilized, and classical sensibility. The wealthy began to install private bathrooms in their new grand houses. These were not the simple wooden tubs of the Middle Ages, but elaborate, permanent fixtures, often with running water supplied by a cistern. The act of taking a bath, while still not a daily affair, began to lose its stigma and become a fashionable, luxurious experience once again. This new trend was slow to trickle down to the rest of society, but it marked a significant change in the habits of the elite. The Protestant Reformation also had an unexpected influence. While some Protestant leaders were as suspicious of worldly vanity as their Catholic counterparts, there was also a new emphasis on order, discipline, and a clean, well-ordered household as a reflection of a godly life. The Dutch, for example, became famous for their fanatical cleanliness, constantly scrubbing their floors and polishing their brass. This was a new kind of hygiene, one that was less about the ritual purity of the soul and more about the moral and aesthetic value of a clean environment. The scientific revolution, though still in its infancy, began to slowly chip away at the old medical theories. The invention of the microscope in the 17th century allowed scientists like Antony van Leeuwenhoek to see a hidden world of animalcules in a drop of water. While the link between these microorganisms and disease would not be firmly established until the 19th century with the work of Pasteur and Koch, these early discoveries began to plant the seeds of a new understanding of the invisible world.
Public health measures also began to become slightly more sophisticated.
towns began to experiment with rudimentary sewer systems, paving streets, and organizing more regular garbage collection. These efforts were still driven primarily by the desire to reduce smells and obstructions, but they had a cumulative, positive effect on the urban environment. These were all small, hesitant steps. For the vast majority of people, life in the 16th, 17th, and even 18th centuries was still dirty, smelly, and unsanitary by modern standards. The fear of miasma remained a powerful force, and the full-body bath was still a rare event for most. But the tide had begun to turn. The absolute, medically sanctioned fear of water that had dominated the late Middle Ages was beginning to recede, replaced by a new, emerging set of ideas that would eventually, over the course of centuries, lead to the modern world of sanitation, public health, and the daily shower.
Lessons from the medieval dirt. To look back on the filth and squalor of the Middle Ages can be a shocking and unsettling experience. It is easy to feel a sense of smug superiority, to be grateful for our modern world of flush toilets, clean water, and antibacterial soap, but to dismiss the medieval experience as simply a story of ignorant people living in filth is to miss the profound and important lessons that this long, dirty chapter of our history has to teach us. The first lesson is one of humility. Our current understanding of hygiene is a very recent development in the grand sweep of human history. For thousands of years, people lived in a world they did not understand, battling invisible enemies they could not name. Their theories of miasma and humoral imbalance were not foolish superstitions. They were rational, good faith attempts to make sense of a terrifying and unpredictable world based on the evidence available to them. The medieval experience reminds us that our own scientific knowledge is not absolute. It is a work in progress, and future generations may look back on some of our own practices and beliefs with the same sense of baffled amusement.
The second lesson is about the immense and often invisible importance of public infrastructure. We take for granted the complex, hidden systems that keep our world clean: the underground sewer pipes, the water treatment plants, the regular garbage collection, the health and safety regulations. The medieval world shows us what life is like without these things. It demonstrates that individual efforts at cleanliness are almost useless in the face of a fundamentally unsanitary environment. True public health is not just a matter of personal choice. It is a collective achievement, the result of massive, long-term investment in shared infrastructure. The third lesson is about the incredible resilience of the human body and the human spirit. For centuries, people lived in conditions that we would consider to be utterly intolerable. They were surrounded by filth, plagued by parasites, and exposed to a constant barrage of deadly diseases. And yet, they endured. They built cathedrals, they wrote poetry, they raised families, they fell in love. They found ways to create order, beauty, and meaning in the midst of the squalor. The human capacity to adapt, to normalize, and to find joy even in the most challenging of circumstances is a powerful and enduring testament. Finally, the story of medieval hygiene is a powerful reminder of the transformative power of a single revolutionary idea. The germ theory of disease, when it finally arrived in the 19th century, was one of the most significant intellectual breakthroughs in human history. It rewrote our understanding of the world and led directly to the public health revolution that has saved billions of lives. The long, dark, and dirty centuries that preceded it are a stark illustration of the consequences of not having that crucial piece of knowledge. To study the filth of the Middle Ages is not just to look back at a distant and unpleasant past. It is to gain a deeper appreciation for the fragile, hard-won, and incredibly recent nature of our own clean, modern world. It is to understand that the battle against dirt is a battle for civilization itself, and it is a battle that is never truly, finally won.